you so much for joining us here this evening. All right, so the news coming out of Gaza is complicated. It is very dire. Israel denying that there is a problem of starvation, widespread starvation, and blaming the UN. Meanwhile, the UN blaming Israel. The situation here is a blame game, and meanwhile, people are dying on the ground.
Well, first of all, the Israeli Defense Forces spokesperson's unit released a video showing several Hamas terrorists inside the tunnels of Hamas feasting on fruits, meat, supplies, rations, expressing how good life was in the tunnels for them. So it's very, very clear that Hamas continues to plunder the aid that is sent into Gaza. It's correct that 900 trucks sit there on the border with the Gaza Strip, awaiting distribution by the organizations that are responsible for doing so inside the Gaza Strip. But I think that all of this calls for a question that must be answered, namely, what is our immediate-term strategy inside Gaza with long-term implications? And it's worth hearkening back to the fact that there is a very clear plan that has been put on the table. Everybody says there is no plan. Nobody has a plan. Everybody's rejected a plan that's not correct. The President of the United States put forward a plan, a vision for the Gaza Strip, wherein the Palestinian Arabs inside Gaza would have the opportunity to locate elsewhere if they chose to do so. Nothing has been done to push that forward. Nothing has been done to move that forward. And if it's not acted upon, if something isn't done in order to make that happen, then I'm afraid that the State of Israel is going to have responsibility over all of the Gazans in perpetuity, including all of the complications that escort that, and with all of the security threats that will invariably ensue from that reality. So I think that Israel needs to be pushing forward pretty aggressively the opportunity for the Gazans to relocate en masse. And I think anything short of that is merely a Band-Aid over a very, very serious problem.
Back here in the studio with me, Benjamin. Anthony, you were mentioning earlier that there is a plan for Gaza, but there isn't a plan for an alternative that is realistic to Hamas right now. There isn't.
Well, there shouldn't be a plan for an alternative to Hamas because, in my opinion, Lehi Levian Joffe, the commentator who just appeared here, is right to talk about how all people of good conscience might feel a particular way in the face of a humanitarian crisis. But that's not what this is. This is not a humanitarian crisis. This is a people that have been beneath the jackboot of Hamas, very often have been supportive of Hamas, who are immiserated as a consequence of their own leadership's actions.
I'm sorry, I have to ask you, what are you basing this on when you say that there is no humanitarian crisis and we look at what aid organizations are saying
I'll tell you what,
and images that are coming out of it?
I'd be happy to tell you what I base it on. I base it on the crowds that surrounded our hostages when the hostages were released home, that were baying and chanting and, to my mind, didn't seem to be starving at all. I base it on the strong men that held our hostages as they stood them and paraded them out there like apes, like circus monkeys, before they sent them back to Israel. And I want to come back to my point about there being a solution on the table. The international community has very clear conventions. My patience for this circular conversation has worn thin. It wore thin a long time ago. There are very clear conventions in the international community. In a war situation where there is a displaced population, neighboring states and non-neighboring states are implored by the international community to absorb them, to absorb the displaced, and then applauded for doing so. We saw that in the case of the Syrian civil war. Neighboring state Turkey absorbed them. Non-neighboring Germany did the same. We saw it in the case of the Ukraine war. Neighboring Poland absorbed them. Non-neighboring Israel did the very same, implored and then applauded. Such must be the standard that's applied here to the Gaza Strip. There is not supposed to be a perfect permutation for feeding and propping up a displaced population such as we see in Gaza. The best that we can do is actually call on all of these countries and all of these communities and all of these organizations that are so dedicated to the good and the welfare of the Gazan people to actually consider absorbing them, to actually giving them succor within their borders, because the fact of the matter is that population cannot and must not, in my opinion, be left to reconstitute itself on the borders of the State of Israel. And I also want to say one last thing. I was a combat soldier who served here in the Israel Defense Forces like so many other combat soldiers. The IDF does not want to be in perpetuity in control of the distribution of aid. It is fraught with problems, and those who criticize us today will never stop criticizing us because inevitably it becomes more complicated as time goes on. The obvious goal is to implement the Trump vision. It's a perfectly reasonable vision. We've seen similar things happen elsewhere. Such can happen here as well.
We're seeing this international pressure growing, especially on Israel. Does that change anything really when it comes to whether or not Netanyahu, for his part, is willing to sign a deal? We have, of course, Hamas on the other side. But the international pressure, does it push Israel in any direction?
We've seen the international pressure rise and fall and ebb and flow throughout this conflict since the October 7th massacre. To this point, that hasn't deterred Prime Minister Netanyahu from pressing forward, though it has delayed him at certain points. We all remember, for example, that he decided to not send in the Israel Defense Forces to Rafah prior to Ramadan of last year. I thought that that was a mistake, incidentally. I think that we should have deliberately operated in accordance with our strategic goals inside the Gaza Strip, including during the period of Ramadan. I think that that was an error. But the Prime Minister has pressed forward. He's remained adherent to his dual war goals, namely the return of the hostages and the dismantling of Hamas, and then a spin-off which is preventing Hamas from ever constituting a threat to the people of Israel ever again. But it's a little bit more complicated given the president is now Donald Trump. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu knew how to handle President Joe Biden with far greater aplomb than he would be able to handle Donald Trump if Donald Trump were to demand an end to the hostilities. But we'll have to wait and see. So far, direct pressure, overt pressure from President Trump himself is not forthcoming towards Prime Minister Netanyahu, which means that we have the ability to continue to maneuver there. And I also will just tell you, people need to deal in reality. This whole notion, this ridiculous phrase of permanent ceasefire is absolutely nonsensical garbage. There is no permanent ceasefire with Hamas as long as they exist inside the Gaza Strip. And to go back to my point, and I want people to stay focused on this, there's no permanent ceasefire as long as you have a militant and extreme population inside the Gaza Strip that readily allows Hamas to recruit from among its numbers. We have to look at the broader vision, and I believe that that broader vision has been put forward by President Trump.
All right. This approachment that we're seeing from Syria towards Turkey, how surprising is it on the one hand, and how concerning is it for Israel?
This should be a cautionary tale when it comes to people who are overly optimistic about the prospect of normalization or some sort of security agreement or some sort of end to the state of enmity between Syria and the state of Israel. And the reason for that is that Israel had very positive relations with Turkey, including very high-level military coordination, training exercises, exchanges of intelligence, exchanges of personnel, you name it, we had it. And then came the incident of the Mavi Marmara. And in the wake of the Mavi Marmara, Erdogan unmasked himself as a double-dyed, unrepentant anti-Zionist, and I would say anti-Semite. It's not surprising, therefore, that al-Julani, when he sees that Israel is enforcing its two red lines, which are very, very clear. The special envoy to Syria said it's extremely complicated. I disagree with that. I think it's very clear. There are two red lines that have been delineated. The first one is south of Damascus will be a demilitarized zone, according to Prime Minister Netanyahu's doctrine. And the second one is that the State of Israel will give security guarantees to the Syrian Druze out of deference to our appreciation and love, quite frankly, for the Druze community within northern Israel. Both of those have been offended, both red lines, by al-Julani's actions and the actions that al-Julani has permitted during his presidency. And so when he sees that Israel is willing to enforce its red lines, he's naturally going to seek an alliance with somebody who has a negative opinion and a negative attitude and negative relationship towards the state of Israel. Enter Erdogan. One could have anticipated this. I think everybody needs to step away from the wishful thinking about some sort of immediate peace agreement or normalization between Israel and this jihadist terrorist, in my opinion, who's cleaned up his image, but I would imagine carries the same sentiment in his heart.
Pezeshkian saying that that Tehran is ready to for another confrontation, and that he doesn't believe that the ceasefire will hold. Your thoughts?
Well, just regarding the various explosions in Iran for a moment, Israel needs to continue to press its advantage there. It said that it has not a fixed regime change for one of its goals of the war with Iran, but it certainly wouldn't be against optimizing the conditions for regime change, two of which are a teetering regime and a restive and organized population. So the continuing demonstration of the frailty and fragility of the regime is something that Israel should promote and push forward, and could well be doing so by way of this. In addition to that, it's able to act with greater impunity in Iran now that Israel is, I wouldn't say free, but somewhat relieved of the looming threat of Hezbollah inside southern Lebanon. We took that out. We dealt with it. It's not been completely eliminated, but it's certainly impoverished and weakened as a fighting terror army. But Israel, to your question, is preparing itself for the potential next round with Iran. And just to give some facts, the munitions for Israel's Arrow system have been ordered for replenishment by Israel. 42 billion shekels for those very munitions were approved by the government, those having been expended during Gideon's Chariots and Operation Rising Lion. So it seems that the Iranians may be saber-rattling again. Israel's not taking any chances and, of course, readying itself for the defensive requirements that such a conflagration could impose on us once again.
All right, Benjamin Anthony, thank you very much for being with us this evening in the studio.
Thank you.
For your input.